Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the 50 best books of the last 50 years. Because I like to always give you something a bit extra, I'm actually going to give you the best 51 books of the last 51 years. The reason for that is I am 51 years old. In fact, I am 51 years old today. So to mark my birthday, I'm going to give you what I think is the best book from every year that I've been alive. So obviously this is a very subjective list, and confession, I have not read every book that was published in the last 51 years. So you may well have different opinions on what was the best book of each of the years I'm going to talk about. Feel free to leave your recommendations in the comments. Right, so let's start with 1973. So my favourite book from 1973 is Dead City by Shane Stevens, an incredibly bleak and horrific gangster novel. Sadly out of print now. I think it's absolutely fantastic and well worth checking out. Moving on to 1974, one of my favourite horror novels, The Rats by James Herbert. Very graphic, very fast-paced, very 70s. I absolutely love it. From 1975, we have The Eagle Has Landed by Jack Higgins, an absolute classic World War II thriller. From 1976, another very disturbing book, Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mendal Johnson. I think it's one of the 10 most disturbing books I've read. A really, really horrific tale of kids doing awful things. From 1977, a book from one of my favourite authors, Stephen King, The Shining. I think The Shining is King's best book. It's certainly the one I find myself going back to most often. Very well known, but definitely deserves to be on this list. I think it's a fantastic book, both about writing and a great horror story as well. From 1978 then, something very different, Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin, a fantastic San Francisco set soap opera, originally published in serial form in a San Francisco newspaper, just a really fun and engaging story. From 1979, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, a fantastic collection of kind of horror short stories, all with a fairy tale kind of spin to them. Really, really worth checking out. From 1980, a fantasy novel. Now, I'm not a big fan of fantasy, but there are a couple of fantasy books on here. This one is The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe, the first in a series of books, and one of those fantasy novels that manages to create a completely new world without spending loads of time telling you that it's creating a new world. So a really engaging story and a fascinating book. From 1981, the serial killer classic Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. I think I slightly prefer The Silence of the Lambs, but that wasn't my favourite book of the year it came out. So I'm going for 1981, I'm going to go with Red Dragon, Hannibal Lecter's first appearance, and a fantastic thriller. From 1982, we have the first comic book on the list, V for Vendetta by Alan Moore. Just a fantastic story, really, really well told, really gripping, and still resonates today in terms of its kind of depiction of the fight against fascism. From 1983, a great time travel sci-fi novel, The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers, which is one of those books that manages to wrap a load of different things together and just make a really engaging and fun story that makes you think a bit as well. From 1984, we have The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks, a really dark, weird book, quite disturbing at times, but also very, very funny. It manages to get the balance between humour and horror just right, in my opinion, and I think it's a fantastic book. From 1985, a Western, A Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, just a wonderful, all-encompassing story that reflects on all the different elements of the human existence, really. A great adventure story, but just a great novel as well. From 1986, another comic book, Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Spiegelman's reflections on his family's experiences in Auschwitz. Absolutely horrific to read, but fantastic as well. Just a really human book that is well worth reading if you haven't read it. From 1987, Beloved by Toni Morrison, a great mix of kind of social commentary and horror that really resonates. It's still got power today. It's just a fascinating book and excellently written. From 1988, Touching the Void by Joe Simpson, a non-fiction account of a disastrous mountain climbing expedition, which is really gripping but really reflective as well. A fantastic book. From 1989, From Hell by Alan Moore. Moore's fantastic recreation of the Jack the Ripper case. Really grim and gritty at times, but also just a fantastic book and really kind of multi-layered in a way that only Moore can do. From 1990, another very disturbing book, I Was Dora Suarez by Derek Raymond, a fantastic crime novel that really reflects on the relationship between the detective investigating a case and the victim of that murder. Just absolutely brilliant. From 1991, The Cipher by Kathe Koja, a really, really weird horror novel that has just stuck with me since I read it. Very, very bizarre, but definitely worth reading. From 1992, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This is a book I tried to read 3 times before I finally managed to finish it, but I'm so glad I did. A really excellent mystery and just a beautifully written and constructed book as well. From 1993, one of my favourite thrillers, A Simple Plan by Scott Smith. A very simple story about some guys who discover some money in the woods and decide to take it, and it's just about how their lives kind of spiral out of control from that one choice. But fantastically well written, really, really gripping. It's just an unrelenting thriller. From 1994, The Fermata by Nicholson Baker, a very weird kind of sci-fi novel about a guy who can stop time and uses his ability to stop time to perv on people, basically. But it's a really interesting, it's quite darkly comic book at times, but just a fascinating read. From 1995, Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates, one of the grimmest but most convincing depictions of what it's like to be a psychopath that I've ever read. Absolutely fascinating. From 1996, another fantasy book, A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I think Martin's work is just brilliant, and The Game of Thrones, the first book in that series, just does everything so perfectly. Great characters, great storylines. It's just completely gripping, and again doesn't bog itself down in world building. From 1997, Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned by Walter Mosley, a fantastic book about a guy who's recently been released from prison and about him trying to make a life for himself. I can't recommend this book and the sequels to it highly enough. Well worth checking out if you like crime fiction. From 1998, another crime novel, Blood Red Rivers by Jean-Christophe Granger. So this is a French book that kind of mashes together a serial killer thriller with a mountain climbing thriller. It's just fantastic. It's a thriller-minute book, really, really gripping, just excellent stuff. From 1999, a kid's book, The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket, the first of the Lemony Snicket books. I love this. I think they're such enjoyable, playful books that can be enjoyed by adults as well as kids. From 2000, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. Just a fantastic novel. And this is one of those books that's kind of, it sounds like it might be quite dull, and it's just about a couple of guys starting a comic book. But it's so wonderfully done. There's so much that goes on in this book. It's completely gripping and just endlessly entertaining and thoughtful throughout. From 2001, Mystic River by Dennis Lehane, a fantastically deep crime novel. So this really gets into the kind of depths of the human psyche. I think Lehane is a really good writer. He's the only writer, I think, oh no, there's one other. There are 2 writers who've got 2 books on this list. Lehane is one of them. Mystic River is just a fantastic crime novel. From 2002, Fat Ollie's Book by Ed McBain. So Ed McBain is my favourite writer, but most of my favourite books by him were published before I was born. Fat Ollie's Book is one of the later books in his 87th Precinct detective series, and it's one that interweaves a lot more humour into its tale than many of his books do, and it's just beautifully done. He manages to write the story with a lightness of touch that is really, really engaging. From 2003, We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. Another really, really disturbing book, but brilliantly done. And it just builds up the tension as the book continues until you get to a climax, which is absolutely devastating. From 2004, another disturbing book, Notice by Heather Lewis. A really graphic, dark, disturbing account of what it's like to be a survivor of abuse. Just brilliant. From 2005, The Devotion of Suspect X by Keigo Higashino, a really fascinating, intricate Japanese murder mystery. I really, really love this book, and I've read a couple of other books by Higashino, which I really liked as well. From 2006, Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, a really great thriller that just has twist after twist after twist. Again, it's a really, really dark book, but it's one that I was just completely gripped by. From 2007, The Terror by Dan Simmons, so a historical horror novel, really, really detailed in terms of its depiction of like life on like exploratory ships in the Victorian age, but does it really, really well in a way that keeps it interesting. You never feel like you get bogged down in the detail, despite the amount of detail that's in the books, and the actual horror story that's interwoven into that is just fantastic as well. From 2008, the second book from Dennis Lehane, The Given Day. So this is a kind of gangster novel set in, I think, the 20s or 30s. Just really gripping. One of those books with loads of different characters that you really feel like you get to know and get to care about. I would compare this in some ways to something like Lonesome Dove. So you might think you don't enjoy like kind of crime epics in the same way you might think you don't enjoy westerns. But if you like Lonesome Dove, you will like The Given Day. From 2009, 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, a very weird, very long, very self-reflective sci-fi novel, which I, despite its length, just flew through. I was completely gripped by this book. It's a fascinating, fascinating read. From 2010, Room by Emma Donoghue. So a book about a woman and her kid confined to a single room. A really, really fascinating book. Not the kind of thing I necessarily normally enjoy, but I thought this was brilliantly done. From 2011, The Dictator's Handbook by Alistair Smith and Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, a really interesting non-fiction like politics book about how people take power in like coups and things like that, how people become dictators and how they then cling on to power. But it then reflects on how similar things happen in democracies as well. Really, really interesting book, and one I reflect on every time I watch the news pretty much. From 2012, a graphic novel, My Friend Dharma by Derfback Derf. So Derfback Derf, the author, went to school with Jeffrey Dahmer, and this is his kind of memoir of what it was like to know Dahmer as a teenager. Really dark, really, really interesting. From 2013, Nunslinger by Stark Holborn. So this is a collection of, I think, 12 novellas that tell the story of a nun in the Old West. Really fun, so a kind of really pulpy vibe to them, but just endlessly enjoyable as well. Really, really recommend. This is a book that you don't hear talked about much. I really think it deserves more attention. From 2014, another graphic novel, Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. Kind of like The Bloody Chamber, the book I talked about earlier. This is has kind of retellings of fairy tales and things like that, but really, really dark. Emily Carroll's artwork is fantastic in this. Definitely worth checking out if you like kind of horror comics. From 2015, Finders Keepers by Stephen King, the second of the Bill Hodges books. This was my favourite of the trilogy. I thought it was just fantastic and has really interesting reflection on writing. You often get that from King, but I think he does it particularly well in this one. From 2016, The Laws of the Skies by Gregoire Courtois, another fantastically dark book. This is about a group of school kids on a trip who go on a trip into the forest and all die. And you know that's what's going to happen right from the first page. Really, really dark, but brilliantly done. From 2017, My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Tallant. Another really, really dark book, but a fantastic thriller about a girl kind of surviving abuse. Just really raw, but brilliantly done and really, really gripping. From 2018, Milkman by Anna Burns, a book that reflects on the troubles in the 1970s in Northern Ireland, but told with a huge amount of humour and just beautifully lyrical prose. Really, really enjoyable to read, despite some of the darkness in it. From 2019, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, a great crime novel based on like true events, which makes it incredibly grim to read at times, but just brilliantly done, really gripping and really reflective as well. So you follow the lives of some of these characters through the terrible events of the book, but also afterwards, and have kind of their reflections back on things. I thought it was great. From 2020, Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby, a really great crime thriller that does car chases just brilliantly. Car chases are a really difficult thing to do in a book. They work well in movies, they don't tend to work well in books, but Cosby absolutely nails them in this book. From 2021, Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt, a really dark horror novel that uses kind of haunted house tropes and things like that to reflect on kind of fascism and bigotry and things like that in modern Britain. Absolutely brilliant. From 2022, Mary by Nat Cassidy, a really great horror novel that mashes together loads of different stuff, has a really interesting central character and just worked perfectly throughout, I thought. And then finally, from 2023, Julian by Fleur Pierrette, a really moving memoir that's also a great work of political activism. So I made it through the list. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do it. So those are my 51 favourite books of the last 51 years, one book per year. Do let me know in the comments how hugely you disagree with me. I'm sure everyone will have different opinions on their top 51 books of the last 51 years. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.